Ever since we moved into our apartment about 2 months ago, it's been full of surprises. Most of them pleasant, others not so much. The good surprises tend to come in the daylight. A deer, for instance, just outside our window the other morning. We have a patch of woods just outside of us on the west side of the building, and we overlook nature in all its beauty from our second-story balcony each day we look out. My wife and I worried at first that the deer was sick, as it stumbled around lazily and looked for shelter, a strange lump hanging from its belly. It grazed lackadaisically on foliage as it meandered near the parking lot. Our concerns were alleviated the next morning when my wife called me over from getting dressed in the bedroom. "What's up?" I said, stepping out onto the balcony. She looked at me with wide, excited eyes and pointed down silently at the grassy area between us and the forest. The deer was back, walking slowly with a small baby doe trailing behind it. Clearly it had been born very recently. The mother was walking in front, and the doe was following clumsily behind. We watched for almost an hour, as a couple other neighbors on their balconies joined in after hearing our stunned comments. This was something we had never seen at our old apartment in the city, on the 11th floor of a tall building in the downtown core. Birds and wildlife of all kind hung out about the garden and grass that separated us from the woods. We'd seen rabbits and squirrels, chipmunks and turtles. Blue jays, cardinals, goldfinches, and red-winged blackbirds would fly around and land in the trees, singing beautifully outside our window while the sun was shining. We had gotten the new apartment for a bargain, after almost settling for one which was $200 more expensive, with less square footage in a worse area. I had found our new apartment after searching online classifieds on a whim. It had been so cheap, and in a quiet area in a small community just outside of town. Although it was still part of the larger city, technically, it seemed to be autonomous in many ways as its own separate village. The garbage trucks and police cars might have said Harrisport on them, but we told everyone who asked that we lived in Greensville. "Oh, Greensville is so beautiful, but expensive. I could never afford to live there," people would say when we told them where we lived. We'd chuckle and usually not bother telling people what a steal we'd gotten our apartment for in the Chanwings complex. We'd paid the meager first and last month's rent up front, and were asked to sign a 2-year lease agreement. We had agreed eagerly. We should have read the fine print first, though. The apartment was old and built pre-World War II. The age showed in some places more than others, like the mildew-smelling basement and unreliable old elevator. There was also only one washer and dryer for all the tenants in the building, due to the ancient, narrow water lines. There were apartments below us that were actually owned by longtime tenants who lived in them, although most of the people in the building were renters like us. The people below us had apparently removed a load-bearing wall at some point in the past, we had been told by our gossiping superintendent. It was safe, she assured us, but there was a noticeable dip in the center of our floor, running all the way through the apartment. Cracks had formed around the edges of the doors, most of which didn't close properly anymore. The front door had no issues, though, opening and closing smoothly. We could live with a bit of a dip in the floor, and doors that didn't quite close, we figured. We could always try to fix them or put up curtains in the doorways if it came down to it. We weren't fancy, and the low rent and great location easily made up for the problems with the place. It wasn't until we had lived there for a while that I began to realize there were other, larger problems with the place. More pressing concerns than simple structural damage. The first incident happened at night when my wife was at work. She's a nurse and works the night shift at the hospital, rotating from days to night every 2 weeks. I was home alone and was up late watching Netflix when I heard the noise outside. It was around 3 a.m., when usually the halls outside my apartment are quiet and no one is coming or going. The only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the whistle of a soft wind blowing outside in the night. Out in the hallway, though, someone was making a horrible racket. The sound was odd, and it took a moment to realize what it was. Chains. Heavy chains dragging slowly across the carpeted floor of the hallway. I looked at the door and saw it was locked. Good. I paused the episode of The Office I was watching for the 700th time, and listened intently, thinking there had to be a rational explanation. Someone moving furniture in the middle of the night was always possible. But what kind of furniture sounded like that? Like heavy chains dragging slowly across the floor. It was coming closer, I noticed. Chains dragging and heavy feet stomping along slowly, off balance and encumbered, feet dragging with a weight too heavy to bear. And there was another sound, too. Like heavy breathing and a sad, grievous moaning, followed by more of the heavy chains rattling and dragging along the floor. Closer now. The TV screen showed the Netflix menu. The need help icon off to the side caught my attention. Did I need help? The sound continued to get closer and closer, and my feelings of dread intensified. The presence which approached my apartment had an aura, a weird and unnatural feeling to it. It felt like I was standing on an open field, and was seeing large black storm clouds rolling in, blocking out the sun, filling the sky with malicious dread and static electricity. And then realizing I'm trapped in that storm, and can't get away in time. As I watched, the thunder began to bloom in the bellies of the giant dark clouds above me. The light under my door blacked out with shadow, and I realized with alarm that whatever was outside was now right at my door. To my complete horror, the doorknob began to turn slowly from side to side. My chest hurt, and for a moment it felt like I was having a heart attack. The feeling passed mercifully, and I realized I was holding my breath. Maybe I need to see a cardiologist. I tried to breathe as quietly as I could and think of what to do. My phone was broken, and at the worst time possible, so I couldn't call the police. I dropped it at work that day and smashed the screen beyond repair. It wouldn't even turn on anymore. Thank God I'd locked the door, I thought. In Canada, especially in small communities, the door being locked is not always a given. As Michael Moore showed us all those years ago in Bowling for Columbine, when he walked into several surprised Canucks homes uninvited. Those of us who lived here were unsurprised at this. I suppose I should thank him. Since then, I always lock my doors. Especially at night. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, too. I like to stay sexy and not get murdered if possible. The doorknob continued to turn back and forth, and whoever was outside seemed to get the hint and stopped. They kicked the door once, loudly and angrily, and I flinched back in surprise. But then they seemed to give up, and finally began to walk away, back in the direction of the elevator. The heavy chains rattled and dragged, as the feet stomped and clomped down the hallway, and were finally gone. The terrible feeling went with it, leaving just the faintest trace of despair and anger it carried with it. I told Amy about it when she got home, but she was so exhausted after her third 12-hour shift in a row that I'm not sure she even heard. I tried not to take it too personally. They had needed her to stay an additional 4 hours that morning since they had been working short, and had needed someone to stay overtime. She even skipped her usual ritual of post-shift TV watching and went straight to the bedroom, where I could hear her snoring loudly a minute later. I hadn't slept a wink all night. Had been too scared to even move from my seat until the sensible light of day began to stream in through the windows. In the daylight, the whole thing seemed like a bad dream. As these things do when we think back on these parts of our lives we can't explain in the rational light of day. Our brains try to first make sense of them, and then, when that's not possible, the mind simply says, forget it, and we do just that. We pop that box of nightmare juice into a dark closet in the back of our minds, up on a high shelf and out of the way. Only problem is, nightmare juice leaks out when you store it for too long. And what are you doing using a box, dummy? Use a jar or something. It's nightmare juice, not nightmare paperwork. Anyways, the point is I managed to convince myself somehow that the whole thing had been a product of my overtired brain. I told myself I had fallen asleep on the couch and dreamt it. Although I knew that wasn't the truth. Because the truth can't be understood. And if we start down the road of believing the unbelievable, well, that way lies madness, my friend. So after a few days I began to forget and went on with life as normal, blocking out that memory and repressing it with the power of all of my subconscious. I filled in those blocks of memory in my brain's computer with something else, and it was lost for now. Like long division lessons from grade school. Likewise, long forgotten. I repressed the memory so much that a few weeks later I couldn't understand why I was so apprehensive about doing late-night laundry. The machine had been busy all day, and I had put in a load of washing around 2:30 a.m., when it had finally been available for use. It was around 3:25 a.m. when my cell phone timer went off, indicating my clothes were now ready to switch over to the dryer. I couldn't figure out why my hands were shaking and my legs felt like jello as I rode down the elevator to the basement. I got off the elevator and stepped out onto the cold cement floor of the basement. The musty air, filled with dust motes, assaulted me as I stepped out, and I began to cough. I flipped my laundry over to the dryer, inserting change into the machine with shaky fingers. I hit the start button and the machine jumped to life, the old, overworked drum inside spinning loudly, squeaking and squealing until it began to pick up speed and turn smoothly. It was constantly being repaired and usually left our clothes slightly damp, even when turned up to high. After that, I walked back over to the elevator and got on. It started to climb, and I began to have that feeling again. Only this time it was like I was ascending up into the dark storm cloud, as the elevator rose up to our floor. The air felt full of static electricity, and the dread and doom blossomed in my belly and spread up into my chest like fire. By the time I reached the second floor, the feeling had become complete terror, as I remembered suddenly the events of a few weeks prior. They came back in a flash as the elevator doors closed behind me. I felt like I was being watched, but there was no one around. I could feel a presence around the corner, and as I began to walk around it towards my apartment, I actually saw it, shimmering like the heat above the road on a hot day. A figure, hulking and dark, angry and malicious. Their form only a dark mirage stood waiting for me around the corner. It appeared to be looking at me, hungrily, but I couldn't make out its face or any of its features. It didn't move, it just waited for me there, as if it couldn't see me. I was frozen, as if I had just come face to face with a bear in the woods. I had no choice but to go around it. There was no other way to get to my apartment. But I couldn't bring myself to move. There was about 2 feet of space between the form and the wall. I could get past it, but I would be practically brushing up against the thing. The thought of touching that horrible, shimmering shape repulsed me, sickened me. But I had no choice. It was either that or what? Leave the building with no wallet or cell phone? My wife was at work with the car and wouldn't be back until morning. I started to move forward, willing my legs to budge with an effort. The thing stayed still and made no sound. I crept past it, my heart hammering so loud I was sure the thing could hear it and would lunge at me at any second. And what it would do to me? I had no idea. I was finally past, and my knees almost buckled with relief. Without turning away from the thing, I continued backing up away from it, towards my apartment. It stayed exactly where it was, unmoving and silent. I had to turn a corner to get to my apartment door. The thought of letting the thing out of my sight terrified me. Who knew what it was capable of? How fast it could travel? What if I got into my apartment and it followed me in somehow? I shuddered at the thought. I spared a quick glance at my apartment door, to make sure the thing wasn't waiting for me around the corner somehow, like a B horror movie gag. It wasn't. But I suddenly felt the storm clouds again, rushing towards me down the hallway. I spun around and it was there, watching me. It had traveled up the hallway in an instant. I felt for the doorknob behind me, afraid to turn around again, knowing if I did, it would get past me somehow and into my apartment. I backed up into my apartment and slammed the door shut, feeling the presence attack the door an instant later. I locked the deadbolt quickly, just as the doorknob was about to spin away from my grasp. The thing was strong. I felt like it could rip the door right off its hinges if it wanted to. It certainly wasn't one of those pleasant, old-timey ghosts you hear about who need to ask permission to come inside your home. This thing, whatever it was, had no hospitality rules. It hammered at the door and tried frantically to turn the doorknob. After a while, it stopped and was silent again. I heard the familiar sounds of chains and dragging feet up the hallway, until they were gone. The next day, I tried to see if I could get some info from the gossipy landlord. She smirked at me. "I guess you are a night owl. I was hoping you wouldn't be, but you'll just have to be careful to stay out of the halls late at night. I would have warned you, but I didn't want to scare you away. Although, if you read your lease a bit more closely, you might have saved yourself some grief." I went home and read the lease. It was all boilerplate legal mumbo-jumbo until I got to the end. Below everything, in the smallest fine print I had ever seen, were a few lines too small to read without a magnifying glass. I got one out of my drawer in my desk and looked over what we had unwittingly agreed to. My heart began to hammer louder and louder as I read the words. New tenants are hereby notified in writing that in taking possession of this apartment, you agree to inherit the restless spirit of its previous owner, Randall Vernquist, as specified in his last will and testament. If allowed entry to the apartment, said spirit will inhabit apartment for eternity, and will have all privileges associated with tenancy of said domicile. Due to the nature of this agreement, said spirit will not need permission to gain access to the apartment, but will merely require your lack of attention as you shut the door between the hours of 3:30 and 4 a.m. I couldn't believe my eyes. But there it was in writing. I had agreed to it. I had signed my name just above this madness, in fact. Now I know why we got such a good discount. The previous owner wants to sublet here. Forever. And he's not taking no for an answer. The superintendent had laughed at me after I told her about the encounter with the shadowy form in the hallway. She just told me I should have looked closer at the fine print on my lease agreement. Which I did. I had never heard of such an agreement, obviously, but who the hell could say they had? I showed the tiny, minuscule print to my wife, but even with a magnifying glass and her thick glasses, she couldn't make it out with her astigmatism. When I read it out loud, she said it wasn't funny and accused me of trying to make a sick joke to scare her. The only way I could convince her was by going down to the landlord again and asking some more questions about the ghost while she waited around the corner, silently spying. She was as shocked as I was that not only was there a ghost, but that its presence was specifically outlined in our tenancy agreement. Who had ever heard of such madness? I'm sure a lawyer would laugh us right out of the office, saying it was just a stupid joke tacked on at the end of the agreement in jest by a bored typist with a very high-quality printer. But I knew it was no joke. However it had happened, whatever dark sorcery had been involved, it had apparently worked. The specter in the hallway was, without a doubt, Randolph Vernquist. I had gone snooping around the building for more info. I had been overly friendly to all of our neighbors, and was baking brownies and cookies for the first time in my life, trying to butter them up, quite literally, with sweets trying to get more info on our situation. I was especially friendly, no jokes you sickies, with one elderly lady named Monica who lived a floor below us. She had lived in the building forever, so maybe she had known Randolph Vernquist, I thought. She owned her apartment, and her balcony was adorned with flowers and plants of all kinds during the warm months. Her balcony was one floor down and to our left, so I had said hello to her a few times as we both sat outside on sunny days and watched the birds. Over the past couple of weeks, I'd become sort of friends with her. At first, she had been a bit distant, but I finally managed to get her to open up when she saw me out on the balcony with my cat. She apparently loves animals of all kinds, and has been donating to the local animal shelter and other causes for years. I offered to pick up her mail once and found her mailbox stuffed with requests for donations from various shelters and animal welfare charities. She didn't have any pets herself, but when I offered to bring my cat down for a little visit, she was thrilled. She fed the cat treats for an hour. Apparently she had them stored in a cupboard for just such an occasion. A kitty cat house call was apparently just what the doctor had ordered. She beamed from ear to ear while my friendly cat rubbed up against her leg, her belly not full until we got home and she threw up all over my floor, as cats love to do. The other day I got up the courage to ask her. I had waited until we were getting along famously and asked the question. It hung in the air for a while before she answered. "Randolph was an awful man," she said. I felt a chill as my skin broke out in goosebumps. "He lived alone near the end. He drove off his wife with his greed and, well, he was violent. Beat her, strangled her once. She nearly died." She sighed and took a minute before continuing. I passed her a tissue from the box next to me as I saw tears begin to stream from her eyes. "She was my friend for years. We'd sit on the balcony and have tea together, watch the birds. Then she stopped coming over. She wouldn't even come to the door if I knocked. If he answered, he'd curse and yell at me, but I didn't care. One day, he hit me. And the police in those days, well, back then, a man hitting a woman, it wasn't as much of a big deal for them, apparently. They told him not to do it again, and that was the end of it. When I asked about Marcy, they told me to mind my own business." She spit out the last word. "Assholes." I was shocked, but I suppose I shouldn't have been. Of course the man was a monster. That part shouldn't have surprised me. Obviously it seemed to fit. "What happened to her? To Marcy?" I asked. She just shook her head. "Her body was never found. I hoped maybe she'd run away, but I knew she would have contacted me somehow if that was the case. Something happened to her. That bastard, he killed her, I know it. I could just never prove it." I could tell she wanted to say more, that there was more to the story. But she would say no more on the subject for now. I told her I had to know more, that our lives might depend on it. She broke down and began to weep, and I felt terrible for pushing her too far. The woman had clearly been through something traumatic after losing her friend to that monster. I told my wife, and she agreed maybe if we could find out how all of this had come about, maybe it would be possible to get rid of that dark form in the hallway. There had to be a way to get out of that creepy little clause. Something disconcerting has begun to happen, though. The doors around our apartment are getting worse. I told you before how none of them close properly except for the front one, due to the removal of a load-bearing wall below us. Well, now it's the front door acting up. It's starting to form cracks around the corners just like the others. It's starting to stick. It requires a shove with your shoulder to close it or pull upwards to open. I'm worried what will happen. What if it breaks completely and we can no longer close it? Would the ghost just come in during the night, taking up permanent residency as is his apparent right? That was certainly what the lease seemed to imply. The superintendent said she can't fix the door immediately since they have other priorities right now. Apparently a water pipe broke, so we have no running water until it's repaired. We've been living on bottled water for the past day or so, even using it to cook and rinse off veggies. I could understand if it was just any old door, but this is bad. What if next time I go out, it won't shut properly again? Worse yet, Randolph has begun to visit me in my dreams. The last one was the most vivid. And to be honest, I can't remember much of them. They slip away like sand through my fingertips as I awake. In the last dream, it was daytime. I could see the sun outside as I left my apartment. As the door closed behind me, though, I caught a glimpse of something out the window, and saw storm clouds rushing in. Thunder began to blossom and boom. As I entered the hallway, I saw instead of the ceiling was the storm. The walls were on either side of me, but the storm head continued forming above. Rain began to pour, and lightning crashed just a few feet away from me. I tried to go back into my apartment, but it was locked. I turned around and saw Randolph's face just inches away from mine. He was the storm, and the storm was him. His voice boomed and was thunder as he reached past me. "Move, this is mine." I saw the cracks form like dark lightning bolts around me as he braced himself against the door, pushing the door frame until it heaved and buckled. The ceiling sagged down and crashed upon me. And then I awoke. When I woke up, the cracks were there, around the door frame just like in my dream. It's no longer closing properly. Can someone please tell me what the hell is going on? We woke up yesterday morning and the front door of the apartment was gone. Just gone. There was no sign of it. The landlord had no clue what happened, but apologized and hastily replaced it with a new one. It was already too late, though. That much was clear. Perhaps Randolph did something to the door during the night while we were asleep. His power was already growing out of control, as evidenced by my dream and the spidery cracks that he made around the door frame. It's also possible that he was getting help from someone in the building. The dark shape in our apartment is there all the time now. After he made his way inside, his office hours were no longer 3:30 a.m. to 4 a.m. He was now open for business 24/7. He couldn't manipulate any objects in the apartment, but he could move around throughout our home, no longer just confined to the hallway. He shifted and blurred, moving around at impossible speeds, then appearing unbidden. Just as you would begin to forget about him for a moment, you'd jump as you'd see him in your peripheral vision, standing right beside you, his horrifying, shadowy face just inches from yours. His features became more recognizable, his face a dark cloud full of anger and malice. Of course, no one could see him but me and my wife. We invited over a friend who was obsessed with the paranormal. My friend Tony wanted to see the ghost for himself, so we said he could come by. He didn't see anything, but left quickly, saying he had a terrible feeling and couldn't stand to be in the apartment anymore. I know what he means. It's hard to think around that dark cloud. His revolting presence made me feel queasy and sick to my stomach. It made my legs feel watery and made me tremble and twitch with fear and apprehension. I went back over to see Monica, the neighbor, while my wife was at work, and she could tell just by the look on my face what had happened. Either that, or word had already spread throughout the building about our misfortune. The bastard got in, didn't he? I told her that the bastard had indeed gotten in. I was really hoping she might have something I could use to get rid of him. I could tell she knew more than she was saying. She invited me in and I sat with her. I had the cat with me again, and I had to ask her a favor. I can't have her in the apartment with that thing around. I don't trust it. I know it's trying to hurt us and drive us away, and I don't want it to use her against us. I just couldn't live with myself if something happened to her. I put the cat down on her lap, and she settled down immediately, and nuzzled her face into Monica's hand, wanting to be patted and massaged behind the ears. It made my heart hurt to leave her there, but I knew she was better off. I could see the tears welling up in Monica's eyes. She knew how much the cat meant to me, and I could see she was sad for me, and took no pleasure in this exchange. She agreed to watch her, assuring me it was only temporary. Is there anything else you can tell us? Anything at all that could help us get rid of that thing? She sat there for a few moments, rubbing the cat behind the ears while she purred. She appeared to be deep in thought. There's someone who might be able to help, but I have to ask them first. They might not be comfortable dealing with that thing. I didn't hear any more about it until today, when Marcy, Randolph's estranged wife, showed up at our door. Monica was with her. She apologized for lying to me and said she had been scared. She hadn't wanted Marcy to come back. She had almost died once at the hands of Randolph, when he strangled her half to death all those years before. She said she had run off and had wanted to get away from him, but now it wasn't fair that we were left to deal with his restless spirit. Randolph suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the hallway, and lifted Marcy and Monica both up by their throats. They hovered in the air as the dark, humanoid shape held them aloft. Their faces began to turn red and purple. I was starting to panic. What could I do to stop him? He didn't seem to have any weakness that we could find. We had tried all the old standbys, holy water, salt circles, smoldering sage leaves. None of it had worked. I had an idea and stepped out into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. The ghost cried out, howling in agony. Its features suddenly lost all their substance and definition, and Marcy and Monica came crashing down to the ground. Marcy fell badly and her leg twisted beneath her at a horrifying angle as she landed. A large bone in her leg broke and the splintered bone pierced through the skin, protruding by several inches. Blood sprayed in crimson jets from an artery that had been punctured by the sharp edges of bone. The blood spray hit the shadowy form of Randolph and seemed to burn him like acid. It steamed and hissed as he wailed in pain as it hit him. He fell backwards and held his hands up in front of his face as the arterial spray bathed him in its corrosion. The shape of his hands began to burn up like dry kindling, and flames began to lick at the dark outlines of his fingers. Monica suddenly stood up and had a manic look in her eyes. That's what you get, you son of a bitch. Die. That's what happens when you deal in dark magic. The blood which bore your dark form will be your undoing. I had no idea what she was talking about, but as I've already said, I suspected she knew more than what she was saying. The shadowy figure burnt and writhed in pain, its ashes floating down to the floor as Randolph's shrieks of agony became less and less distinct. They began to sound far off and unimportant, as his form began to float away in white flecks of ash that weighed less than air. I looked down at the bloodbath in the hallway. I took off my shirt and used it to apply pressure to Marcy's wound. but I could already tell it was hopeless. She had lost a huge quantity of blood, and the old woman was already beginning to look pale and cold. She shivered, and her eyes had a lost and far-away look to them. I took out my phone and dialed 911. By the time the ambulance arrived, Marcy was already dead, from loss of blood. They attempted with far too much gusto to revive her, but eventually a supervisor came and called it off, drawing a line across her throat with her index finger, a dark look on her face. The police had shown up by then as well, and were asking us questions. Monica and I told the same story, exempting the part about Randolph's ghost, of course. We had already cleaned up his ashes with a small vacuum. I had thrown the whole contraption out hastily in the dumpster outside before the ambulance arrived, not wanting it back in my home ever again. The case was odd, so the coroner came out to investigate. He seemed to be only half interested, and towards the end I heard him talking quietly on the phone about an upcoming trip to his cottage. He called it a simple slip and fall, after asking some pointed questions and doing a quick investigation outside my apartment door. I had sat inside fidgeting while I waited, feeling guilty and scared. I had the feeling he wasn't very good at his job when he came to the door and told me he was leaving, and not to be worried. When Amy got home, there was still police tape in the hallway, and she had to get permission from a patrol officer to slip beneath it and into the apartment, being careful not to disturb evidence. They told us we may need to stay in a hotel overnight, but that didn't end up happening after the coroner filed his report and cleared us of any wrongdoing. The police looked at me strangely when they left, saying they still didn't believe the old woman's story about the bruises around her neck. The same matching bruises from Marcy's neck. But I told them with a straight face that I didn't know anything about that. Monica had been questioned separately and had told me she would come up with something. She told me it was better if I didn't know. The less lies that had to be told, the better, especially if we were questioned with a polygraph. I still don't know what kind of dark magic let Randolph live past his expiration date, to haunt us in the hallways. But I'm not done with my questions for Monica. She still has my cat, too, and she isn't answering her door. I really hope there isn't going to be any more blood magic this week. I'm really getting sick of it. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow, and see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.